Does God exist? And if so, how can his existence be made known to us? St. Paul gives us an idea of how we can know God's existence. We read in Romans chapter 1 verse 20 that ever since the creation of the world, his eternal power and divine nature, invisible though they are, have been understood and seen through the things that he has made. And so according to St. Paul, God's existence is made known through his creation and the things he has made. This is where the scholastics, or theologians who use Aristotelian philosophy, come in. This method of understanding creation in regard to God, or even coming to the conclusion that God exists, is called natural theology. Now, St. Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century famously formulated 5 ways to know that God exists in his work titled the Summa Theologiae. Today we'll cover his famous argument for motion, and how this argument serves as a solid proof or demonstration for God's existence. Now, since Thomas Aquinas is utilizing Aristotelian metaphysics to formulate this argument, we first need to cover how motion or change is possible in the world. Now, this dispute goes back to the time of Aristotle and even before him. Some of the earliest proposals for how change occurs, or the manner in which it does, comes from the Greek philosopher Heraclitus in the 6th/5th century BC. Heraclitus once pointed out that no man ever steps in the same river twice, for it's not the same river, and he's not the same man. For Heraclitus, change is constant. Things never simply become, they are always in a state of becoming. The Thomistic philosopher Henry Grenier notes, Heraclitus of Ephesus taught that all things are in constant flux, or that all things in their very nature are becoming. But many issues arise with Heraclitus' view. For example, how can science arrive at anything fixed, or have universal truth, if everything is in a constant flux of change? Another Greek philosopher, Parmenides, proposed that change is simply an illusion and does not happen at all, and thus Parmenides ends up in a type of monism. But one can easily retort that Parmenides' view is absurd, since we go from a state of not being convinced of Parmenides' argument and then being convinced. So to reject change would lead to a self-refutation or a reductio ad absurdum. Now, the reason both of these philosophers came to these absurd conclusions is that they both had an issue with change coming from nothing. Take, for example, a book which goes through time and deteriorates. Parmenides would say that this deterioration comes into existence from non-being or nothingness, since this deterioration at one point didn't exist, and then after it does. And since something cannot come from nothing, change is impossible for Parmenides. Aristotle refutes both Parmenides and Heraclitus. He argues that the potential for something to change is something real in that thing. And so, for example, the deterioration of the book is real in as much as it is a potential in that book before it actually deteriorates. And it is the conditions of the room, like the heat, that cause it or actualize it to actually deteriorate. Here we have just covered the Aristotelian concept of change, which is that of the act and potency distinction. Gergoux-Lagrange explains the act-potency distinction as such. The statue, in process of becoming, does not come from the statue which already exists, but the thing in process of becoming was at first there in potency, and hence arises from unterminated being, from real and objective potency, which is thus a medium between the existing being and mere nothing. What Lagrange is stating is that potency is not non-being or non-existence. Potency is a real feature of the world, but it is not a full mode of being or existence as actuality is. And so, a book has the potential to deteriorate, and that potency is a real thing in the book, but it does not exist in any full mode of being as actuality. This potency or potential has to be actualized by the heat in the room, which causes it to actually deteriorate in reality. Now that we have the general metaphysics out of the way, we now proceed to Aquinas' actual argument. He states in the Summa Theologiae, the first and more manifest way is the argument for motion. It is certain and evident to our senses that in the world some things are in motion. Now, Aquinas calls this way the more manifest way, in that change is a very evident feature of reality. He then argues that in the world some things are in motion, or that they change. As discussed, change is nothing more than the actualization of a potential. Aquinas continues further. Now, whatever is in motion is put in motion by another, for nothing can be in motion except it is in potentiality to that towards which it is in motion, whereas a thing moves inasmuch as it is in act, for motion is nothing else than the reduction of something from potentiality to actuality. In this, Thomas Aquinas is basically just explaining the nature of the act-potency distinction, and how it relates to causality in that, for a change to occur, a potential must be actualized. Aquinas expounds on this very idea of causality, but nothing can be reduced from potentiality to actuality, except by something in a state of actuality. Thus that which is actually hot, as fire, makes wood, which is potentially hot, to be actually hot, and thereby moves and changes it. And so a potential can be only actualized by something already actual. Aquinas gives the example of a fire. In this scenario, the wood has the potential to be hot. The fire actualizes this potential and makes the wood actually hot. But the wood itself cannot cause itself to be hot. It requires something other than itself, i.e., fire, to make it hot. Now, it is not possible that the same thing should be at once in actuality and potentiality in the same respect, but only in different respects. For what is actually hot cannot simultaneously be potentially hot, but it is simultaneously potentially cold. It is therefore impossible that in the same respect and in the same way, a thing should be both mover and moved, i.e., that it should move itself. St. Thomas Aquinas posits the principle of non-contradiction, basically that a thing or being cannot simultaneously be actually hot and potentially hot in the same respect and way. And so going back to the fire scenario, a wood log cannot be simultaneously actually hot and simultaneously potentially hot, in that it could somehow actualize itself. Remember, the logs require some other thing, such as fire, to actualize wood to make it hot. As a side note, go to the description below and check out 10books.com and use the discount code SANCTUS15 for 15% discount. Therefore, whatever is in motion must be put in motion by another. If that by which it is put in motion be itself put in motion, then this also must needs be put in motion by another, and that by another again. But this cannot go on to infinity, because then there would be no first mover, and consequently no other mover, seeing that subsequent movers move only inasmuch as they are put in motion by the first mover, as the staff moves only because it is put in motion by the hand. Now that we've concluded that every potential is actualized by a previous mover or actualizer, Aquinas then gives a scenario of a hand moving a stick. The stick has the potential to be moved. This potential is actualized by the hand. But what actualized the hand's potential to be moved? Now, you can posit some previous mover and so on, but for Aquinas, this causal chain cannot go on to infinity. Now, at this point, it's important to make a distinction between two types of causal chains. The first one is a per se causal chain, and this is the causal chain that we are dealing with. This causal chain involves secondary movers which are being moved only in virtue of a primary mover. The second causal chain is called a per accidens causal chain. This is one that takes place over time or is temporal. For Aquinas, it is possible that in this per accidens causal chain, it can go on to infinity in time. But remember, this is irrelevant to Aquinas' argument. We are not trying to prove that a being started the universe philosophically, but that a being is keeping it in existence. Now that we've covered the type of causal chain, which is a per se causal chain, why does Aquinas think that this cannot go on to infinity? Well, yet again, movers in this chain are only moved in virtue of a primary mover, since these other movers are secondary movers, as this is a derivative causal chain. As John of St. Thomas says, if there were an infinite regress in causes, no effect or change would ever begin anew. It's simply illogical to posit an infinite regress of movers, as Gergoux-Lagrange as well states. To do away with a supreme cause is to claim that, as someone has said, a brush will paint by itself provided it has a very long handle. So, as Lagrange argues, even if you have an infinitely long paintbrush, you still need a primary mover to actualize the potential of the brush to move. Aquinas finishes his argument up and states, "Therefore, it is necessary to arrive at a first mover, put in motion by no other, and this everyone understands to be God." Now, the conclusion of the argument necessarily follows, since if there cannot be an infinite regress, it must terminate in something which is pure act or pure actuality. This is the case since if there was a potential in the primary mover, it wouldn't be a primary mover. It would necessitate something else to actualize that potential. And so the prime mover must be pure act, or actus purus in the Latin. So Aquinas' argument concludes with a being, which is pure act, without any potential. This means that this being is changeless or immutable. One might ask, why does this being necessarily have to be God? Why can't it just be a changeless thing or entity? Quite simply, by virtue of this prime mover being pure act or changeless, many divine attributes follow forth. For example, this prime mover would have to be immaterial, since matter has the potential to change location, for example. This prime mover would also have to be eternal, since it can't come into existence or cease from existing, since this involves change. As well, it would have to be atemporal or outside of time, since if it moved through time, it would change. Further, this prime mover must be metaphysically simple and not composite, since to be composite would necessitate a composer of the parts, and therefore potential in that thing. So this prime mover is without compounding of different parts. Basically, his essence is the absence of all division, as Lagrange says. Now, can there be multiple prime movers? As Aquinas states, if then many gods existed, they would necessarily differ from each other. Something therefore would belong to one which did not belong to another. And so, according to Aquinas, there must be something to differentiate the multiple prime movers of every per se causal chain in reality. But since the prime movers are all metaphysically simple, there would be nothing to differentiate each prime mover over another, and therefore they would be identical. And so only one prime mover could exist to provide motion to all per se causal chains. As well as Lagrange states, the prime mover is infinitely perfect because pure actuality without any admixture of potentiality. And this is true whether we consider the essence or the action of such a being. And so anything predicated of this being must be infinitely perfect. So for example, the prime mover must be omnipotent or all-powerful, since it has no potential to gain power. Lastly, is this prime mover rational or omniscient? Aquinas states, "We must go on to demonstrate that God is intelligent. We have already proved that all perfections of all beings whatsoever pre-exist in God superabundantly. Now among all the perfections found in beings, intelligence is seen to possess a special preeminence, since intellectual beings are more powerful than all others. Therefore, God must be intelligent." Therefore, from the argument for motion for God's existence, we have demonstrated that there exists one being which is pure act or immutable, immaterial, outside of time, eternal, metaphysically simple, infinitely perfect, omnipotent, rational, and this is what we know of as God. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe, and if you want to help support the channel, consider becoming a channel member. As always, God bless.